All right, guys, we left off last time with James Paw Ferguson. Now, this is where we start talking about progressivism in Texas. So, Paw Ferguson was a Democrat. He was the 26th governor of Texas. He was impeached due to taking money from the Texas Brewers Association, kind of a trust that was basically giving him money to do what they wanted him to do. That's called a bribe. So got himself in trouble there. Now, he was an anti-prohibitionist Democrat. He was also anti-women's suffrage, which doesn't make him very progressive, but there were other things he did do that made him more progressive. So basically, what that means is he wanted to keep alcohol legal and he wanted to prevent women from voting. So, yeah, not very progressive. However, he did do some things for Texas that made him progressive. For example, he put more money into education. So he spent time and energy putting money into education for Texas kids. He put limits on rent. There was no limit on what your rent, your landlord could charge you for rent. So people just got hammered with high prices and couldn't afford their house. So they got no choice, either move out or get price gouged. And you're going to get price gouged by the next guy because they can do that. Then he created the highway department. So prior to that, we really had nobody in charge of, making sure our roads were, safe and passable. So he created the highway department to improve roads all across Texas. All right. So now we come to, these reforms. So there's reforms, well, for some, but not for everybody. So, which groups could not vote in Texas? There are three of them. When you think about African Americans, Hispanics, and women, all of them could not vote. There were things like the poll tax, for example. A poll tax was just that, a tax that you had to pay to vote. So, it was basically keeping it economically impossible for the poor to vote. In that time period, the majority of poor people were Hispanics and African Americans. So now we also had literacy tests because of the state of uh, schools for African Americans in Texas. You have a lot of people who weren't educated. So if you can't read because you had to go to work or you were working, in child labor on a, cotton farm, then you weren't going to learn to read. And if you couldn't read well enough to impress somebody at the polling station, you weren't going to be allowed to vote. So, the other problem there was that is at the discretion of the person who was administering the test. So if that person happens to be racist as well, guess you're not voting today. Then you also have hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They used fear and violence, basically a terrorist organization, to prevent people from voting. So while this is the reform era, it's also the era of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is the rise of segregation. Check out this video on Jim Crow. I'll warn you now about that video. There is some pretty offensive imagery in it, but it's the history of Jim Crow, and it is the reality of what was done to make segregation legal. Um, where the law that came, like where the law of segregation came from, this idea of separate but equal, where you would have one area for whites and other areas for blacks and Hispanics. Well, that comes from this legal case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a guy basically in Louisiana. He tried to ride on a train in a section of the train by Louisiana state law that was reserved for whites only. And so he sat in that area and they threw him off the train and he was arrested. So the idea there is that he sued, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court at the time, being largely stacked with racists, voted to uphold the the constitutionality. What that means is that they said no, segregation under separate but equal is allowable. Now, the key here is that these things weren't equal. No state could afford to have two of everything exactly the same, and they never intended to. They absolutely always intended to have separate but unequal. They they wanted to basically force African Americans and Hispanics into a second class citizen role and do it legally. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in one of its classic bad decisions, allowed it. All right, so now we move on to how long this lasted. Plessy versus Ferguson was in like supporting the law all the way into 1954 when we have Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And we will talk about that later on when we get into the civil rights movement. And that's where we have desegregation of schools when they look at it and say inherently things that are separate are not equal. So that's a big major case here in the United States. Now we get to how the African Americans and Hispanics and uh, women finally earned their rights to vote and fought for their equality. It was through these groups here, these different associations of people organized to fight for their rights, to protest through nonviolent means and through civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, so everybody understands, this is where you purposely go out and break the law because you want to be arrested. You are forcing them to look at these, the unfairness of this. Um, Women were some of the first to actually do this here in America. When we get to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, that's this group here. They are founded in Paris, in Paris, Texas, in 1881. They get together and they decide that they want to fight for no, for prohibition, basically no alcohol allowed in the state of Texas. And what they're fighting for over here in this cartoon where you see wet or dry, what are they voting for? Their county to be wet or dry, to have alcohol or not. So they vote, if you vote wet for my sake, for this rich guy here, you're voting for him so he can, sell alcohol and make money. If you're voting for her sake, you're voting dry. So, her children will have a father who comes home and doesn't spend all his money, meaning the entire paycheck, at a bar. And that was something that happened a lot. These men would go off and, make money. That's the pool cleaner in the background. These men would go off and make money, get paid on, their week's wages, and then they would go immediately across the street from the factory to the pub or the bar and end up drinking up all the family's money, which was a huge problem back then. There were a lot of people who suffered from alcoholism. Now, when we get to how women changed the laws, women did a lot of different things to fight for and change things in Texas. So, sorry about that. Women wanted to restrict alcohol, prohibition. They got that done. That became a law in the 1900s, all the way through the 1930s, I believe. I'd have to double check when prohibition was repealed, but it was through the 20s and the 30s. Women wanted suffrage. They fought and fought and fought, but they don't get that until the 1920s, so after World War One. They organized the PTA. That is a thing created by mothers to the Parent Teacher Association to improve schools and home lives. And then eventually with the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage in 1920, that comes to women. Okay, so this is an interesting website here about women's suffrage. And then on the next page where we talk about 1920, this is a great video on women's suffrage. Check it out. I think you'll find it interesting. All right, so that is the uh, progressive movement, largely in Texas. We're going to talk about some political stuff here in the next one, and then we will go from there.